This video and the following review marathon are dedicated to my friend, Haydox. If you're watching this, know that I miss you and hope you're happier in your new offline life. Live long and prosper, buddy. Greetings and welcome back, gentles and ladiesmen, to another review marathon that's been a long time coming. I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and we're finally getting to those damn Dreamcast era reviews I promised back in September? Again, my apologies for the wait. I've already wasted enough of your time, so let's just get this show on the road, shall we? Following on the heels of the Sega CD and Sega 32X, the Sega Saturn was finding limited success. Despite Sega's best efforts, the system never quite caught on and was thus overtaken by the Sony PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. Despite facing some considerable debt, Sega laid all their cards on the table in a last-ditch effort to reclaim their share of the market. Enter the Sega Dreamcast, the first 128-bit console of the 6th generation. It was also one of the first consoles to offer internet support, analog triggers, and progressive scan visuals. By going all out on the technical side of things, Sega hoped to get a running start in the 6th generation, sort of like what Microsoft did with the Xbox 360. Sega also tried to scrounge up some AAA content at or shortly after launch in 1998 to sway gamers back to their side. One of these games was a next-gen 3D Sonic game, titled Sonic Adventure. Originally beginning development as an RPG title featuring Sonic and friends, Sonic Adventure evolved into a 3D platforming game featuring multiple playable characters and gameplay styles, and went on to become the highest-selling game on the system. In 2003, an enhanced port of the game, Sonic Adventure DX Director's Cut, was released for the Nintendo GameCube. In 2010, a digital port of the GameCube version was released for Steam, PSN, and XBLA. As you might have realized from the title of this video, I will not be covering those versions of Sonic Adventure in this review. Rather, I will be dedicating a separate remake or rebreak video to both Sonic Adventure titles, in which I will discuss differences between the originals and their re-releases. If I were to include the version comparison segments of that video with the actual reviews, then these reviews would quickly balloon into the 50-minute zone, and I, for one, would not want to watch a single video that is that long. I'm kind of pushing things as it is, so for this video I will be reviewing the Dreamcast version and that version alone. While the game and its two sequels were rather well received for their time, many critics and gamers have been fairly critical of them since the release of games such as Shadow, 06, and Secret Rings in the mid-2000s. Sonic Adventure 1 in particular has something of a polarizing reception as far as 3D Sonic games go. For the most part, people either love this game and consider it among the best 3D Sonic games, or hate it and consider it an abomination of programming that betrayed what we loved about the classics. The result has been a monolithic surge of video reviews, written reviews, Let's Play series, and live streams dedicated to Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2 in particular. Despite being almost 18 and 15 years old respectively, the Sonic Adventure games are somehow even more relevant in the Sonic community than ever. And everyone and their brother wants to explain why their opinion of this game is correct and yours is wrong. Frankly, I consider Sonic Adventure one of the most over-reviewed games of all time. So why am I reviewing it then? And why spend over 30 minutes doing so? I wouldn't bother throwing another video into the oversaturated Sonic Adventure review cesspool if I didn't feel like I had something new and worthwhile to say about it. That being said, it is impossible for me to offer a complete, nuanced opinion of Sonic Adventure in only 10 minutes. That also means that I am going to be talking about the same things reviewers have talked about a million times. And if that's not something you want to watch, then I have many other shorter videos you can watch instead. I have dedicated this video to answering one simple question: how well does Sonic Adventure hold up as a game on its own merits? While I certainly have my own opinion on the subject, I will not be discussing whether this game is better or worse than the classic games. I feel like the vast majority of reviewers, particularly classicists, focus too much on that question and not enough on whether this game is good for what it's trying to be. Without further ado, this is Sonic Adventure for the Sega Dreamcast. Let's begin with the plot. As I mentioned before, Sonic Adventure began development as an RPG, and thus retains a more in-depth storyline than any Sonic game before. All 6 playable characters sport their own plot, which overlap and build on the others to tell a more complex story. I'll give a brief synopsis of those arcs later on, but for now I want to focus on my impressions of the story rather than the details you've heard a million times from other reviewers. The general consensus is that the story isn't very good, with many reviewers often poking fun at the cheesy cutscenes and questioning just how much sense the whole thing makes. And they aren't wrong to do so, because Sonic Adventure's story presentation hasn't aged that well. The voice acting is pretty cheesy by today's standards. The animations are stock, looping, and awkward looking. The lip syncing is only set to match the original Japanese dialogue, and the overall presentation is just kind of lacking. Still, most of the lines are delivered competently enough, sufficient information is given to the player so they can understand what's happening and why, and the characters' motivations and objectives are pretty clear. Some reviewers have seen fit to trash this game based on its storytelling alone, apparently forgetting what a lot of video game storytelling was like back in the early 3D era. It wasn't until the Sony platforming trio and other games hit the scene in the early 2000s that good writing, voice acting, and animations became industry standards. And even then, things didn't become amazing overnight. Before, it wasn't uncommon for even the most AAA of titles, such as 1997's Castlevania Symphony of the Night or Star Fox 64, to feature some hokey localization and voice acting.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. Have at you.
Can't let you do that, Star Fox. Andros has ordered us to take you down.
Daddy, long time no see.
Long time no see.
Yes, Metal Gear Solid also came out around the same time and had great writing and voice acting, but 90% of the cutscenes took place within 2D codec sequences and the character models didn't even have mouths. Sonic Adventure was one of the first games to feature cutscenes where characters moved around and had lip-sync dialogue. Back then, this was new and impressive, but it quickly became obsolete when Jak, Ratchet, Sly, and Metal Gear Solid 2 hit the scene 6 months after Sonic Adventure 2. Point is, when viewed by today's standards, Sonic Adventure's storytelling is rather dated, but when considered alongside other big releases of its time, it falls along that same quality standard. If people can put up with the story presentation in Resident Evil, Symphony of the Night, and Star Fox 64, then why can't Sonic Adventure get the same treatment? For that reason, I'd call Sonic Adventure's story passable. At the end of the day, it's a game where you run around loop-de-loops and collect rings as a blue hedgehog. How good do the voice acting and localization of the story need to be for the game itself to be good, especially given its late 90s release date? While I won't knock the game too hard for its story presentation, I do have other gripes. Because the game tries to tell an overarching story through 6 different character scenarios, you're going to be seeing a lot of cutscenes multiple times. Take this cutscene right here. Since Amy, Gamma, Tails, and Sonic all appear in this scene, you have to watch a different variation of it as all 4 characters. To the game's credit, it does slightly change the dialogue each time, but you're still watching the same boring thing 4 times. And there are many other cutscenes that play at least twice. Tails' scenario, for example, copy-pastes about 80% of the scenes from Sonic's scenario. There are times in Amy and Gamma scenarios where you have to sit through over 5 minutes of cutscenes before you can play the game again. Maybe it's because I've played this game more times than most people, but I found myself getting so bored that I'd pull out my phone and mess around on social media just to keep my brain active. But Exo, don't you know that you can just skip the cutscenes? No, actually, I can't. At least, not in the Dreamcast version. You can mash that start button all you want, and believe me, I tried, but all in vain. The credits are kryptonite. There are 6 character arcs in the last story segment, and each one has a long, boring credit sequence at the end. And guess what? You can't skip them in any version of the game. While it is possible to shut off the console and skip them that way, I feel like most players would be afraid of losing progress and wouldn't think to try it. If you're not going to let me skip the credits, then couldn't there at least have been only one credit sequence at the end of the last story segment? Between the credits and the repetitive storytelling, I'm not going to lie, I find revisiting Sonic Adventure to be something of a boring chore at times. While I don't mind Sonic trying to tell a more complicated story, I do think future games have a significantly more balanced cutscene to gameplay ratio. With that being said, let's get into the aesthetics. For a Dreamcast launch title released in 1998, Sonic Adventure doesn't look too shabby, especially if you take advantage of the Dreamcast VGA support to play the game in 480p. The models and animations for the playable characters look pretty nice during gameplay, the level geometry looks great and makes use of well-detailed textures, and the environments are generally nice to look at. The art direction and revamped character designs are also a nice improvement over the classic days, at least in my opinion. In terms of environments, there's a lot of variety in the game's 11 levels and 3 hub worlds, and they're all visually appealing in their own right. You don't forget the looks of stages like Windy Valley, Casinopolis, or even the Sky Deck. Despite Sonic Adventure remaining a good-looking title by Dreamcast standards, 17 years later, the game is showing its age. I've already mentioned that many of the character animations during cutscenes are pretty awkward, but on top of this, the texturing and the player character models looks a little off. Some assets are rather polygonated, and a handful of character models such as E102 Gamma and E100 Zero just don't look that great. Dr. Eggman's character model is by far the worst looking and animated in the game. He has no mouth, his eyes are really distracting, and all of his animations look really stiff compared to any other character in the entire game. For an early Dreamcast game, it's all excusable. Just remember these observations for the remake or rebreak episode. While the visuals have become somewhat dated, the soundtrack holds up wonderfully. While you can definitely tell it was made in the 90s, there's so much production value here that I don't care. To me, Sonic Adventure is where Sonic music went from pretty damn good to the stuff of video game legends. Not only is there a lot of musical variety in terms of genre and instrumentation, but it all fits perfectly with the gameplay happening on screen. There are also a handful of vocal tracks, and most of them are pretty good. Sonic's theme, It Doesn't Matter, sums up the character and what he stands for quite well, while Tails' theme, Believe in Myself, depicts a sidekick who wants to prove himself as a hero of his own. The game's main theme, Open Your Heart, was performed by Crush 40 and is an amazing track in its own right. The only character theme I don't really care for is Amy's theme, My Sweet Passion, which I just find insufferably creepy. Many people consider Sonic Adventure's soundtrack to be one of the best in the entire series, and while my heart personally lies with Sonic Lost World, I totally understand. Out of all the Sonic games I've reviewed so far, Sonic Adventure has my favorite soundtrack hands down. With my thoughts on the aesthetics out of the way, it's time to dig into the gameplay. As I get into the meat of this review, it's worth discussing the general attitude that many classicists and older Sonic fans seem to express towards Sonic's transition to 3D. Watch virtually any other review of Sonic Adventure on the internet, and they'll open with an anecdote about how much they enjoyed Sonic in the good old days, when he was fast, in 2D, and on the Mega Drive. Those games were perfect, they'll say, and had no flaws. The 2D gameplay style was the pinnacle of what Sonic's gameplay has ever had to offer, and the transition to 3D can only change things for the worse. And these people are definitely right about one thing. When Sonic jumped to 3D, his gameplay changed immensely. What I would disagree about is whether or not changing the formula was a bad thing in and of itself. What these people forget is that there was another big platforming mascot whose gameplay changed pretty significantly in the transition to 3D. Anyone ever play a little game called Super Mario 64? If I'm not mistaken, that game was a significant break from Super Mario World. Instead of trying to get to the end of many linear levels, Mario ran around an open world and solved puzzles or defeated bosses to collect power stars and advance through a hub world. This was a huge change, and it occurred due to the technical limitations of the Nintendo 64. While there certainly is a crowd that never cared for this new gameplay style, most Mario fans just rolled with it. They accepted that a one-to-one transition of the 2D Mario gameplay style to 3D wasn't a possibility for the time being, and they were willing to appreciate this new gameplay style for what it was, rather than complaining about what it wasn't. It also helped that Super Mario 64 was generally loyal to the substance of what made previous Mario games fun to play. So, why couldn't Sonic fans do the same for 3D Sonic? If it was possible to easily recreate an authentic 2D Sonic experience in 3D, don't you think Sonic Team would have done that by now? The old mechanics and gameplay were designed for 2D, so when the series hit 3D, Sonic Team had no choice but to reinvent the wheel. That's why there's been so much experimentation over the years. Some of these 3D gameplay styles worked and some of them didn't, but at the end of the day, I think it's very closed-minded to say that Sonic's gameplay can only be good as a 2D side-scroller, and that these other gameplay gameplay styles are terrible because they're not 2D side-scrollers. Whether these gameplay styles suck objectively on their own terms is a different matter. The biggest change to Sonic Adventure's gameplay from previous titles is that each of the game's characters sport different playstyles. Many people, particularly fans of the classic series, seem to argue that having multiple gameplay styles was not a good way to follow up in the previous games. But is it really? The classics went from only having Sonic playable to having 3 characters fully playable with slightly different stories, as well as some exclusive levels and bosses. It was only a matter of time before Sonic Team started giving these characters their own playstyles too. While these playstyles aren't without their flaws, it seems to me that many people are more offended by the fact that they have to play multiple gameplay styles than they are offended by the execution of the individual gameplay styles themselves. Are multiple playstyles in a Sonic game really that bad? As long as the game is fun, does it really matter if each character has slightly different mechanics or goals? Obviously, Sonic Team shouldn't just be able to do whatever they want. They have to keep things loyal to the essential mechanics and stylings that made Sonic fun to play. For the purposes of this review, I would argue that there were 4 such elements. 1. The character should be reasonably fast. 2. There should be an emphasis on platforming. 3. Characters should interact with familiar Sonic set pieces like rings, springs, and robot enemies. And 4. Completing an objective should be straightforward and simple. If a Sonic gameplay style can demonstrate these elements, then I'd argue that it is more or less loyal to Sonic's appeal. Something like the Werehog would fail this test. To be fair, there is an emphasis on platforming, all the familiar set pieces are there, and accomplishing an objective is as simple as getting to the end. At the end of the day though, the slower paced level design makes it decisively not a Sonic gameplay style. With these elements in mind, let's evaluate Sonic Adventure's gameplay styles to see how well they all meet them. Let's kick things off with the Blue Blur himself. Sonic's arc revolves around him and Tails trying to foil Eggman's scheme to use the Chaos Emeralds to power up an ancient water monster named Chaos, destroy human civilization, and build the robotic empire called Robotnik Land on its ruins. In terms of control and mechanics, Sonic's gameplay is probably the closest the game comes to approximating 2D Sonic in 3D. The goal is simply to make it to the end of 10 stages while collecting rings and avoiding bottomless pits. Sometimes you'll collect Chaos Emeralds at the end of stages, and other times you're busting capsules like in the classics. Sonic runs fast, jumps into robots, and can spin dash. Unlike the classics, however, you can activate the spin dash at any time with the push of a button. By pressing the jump button a second time while in midair, Sonic can also do a homing attack into the nearest enemy or air dash to pick up speed. It has been argued that the homing attack removes all challenge posed by the enemies, but if you really don't like the homing attack, then there's nothing stopping you from just jumping into or spin dashing into enemies instead. Sonic's control is tight, fluid, and responsive. Sure, maybe he handles differently than the classics, but all that matters is that he controls well and that he runs pretty fast when at full speed, enough to satisfy an open-minded Sonic fan's craving. Stages are fast-paced and about just the right length. Each one features its own unique stage hazards and set pieces to set them apart from one another. While Windy Valley sees the player making their way through a tornado and invisible walkways, Casinopolis sees the player collecting 400 rings through different pinball minigames to reach a Chaos Emerald. The only stage I really didn't care for was the Sky Deck. The gravity shifting was kind of wonky, and a lot of the platforming was a little claustrophobic for my taste. As with the classics, Sonic Adventure offers its fair share of boss fights. None of them are really that great, but they are generally a nice distraction from the usual platforming. There is one at the end of Sonic's arc that I don't care for. It drags on for like 5 minutes, and if you don't know how to dodge its desperation attack, you'll likely have to redo it at least once. The character battles, on the other hand, offer almost no challenge whatsoever, and many of Gamma's boss fights can be beaten with simple button mashing. And then there's Chaos 4, probably the most uninteresting boss in the game, which you have to fight 3 separate times as each member of the main trio. Overall, the boss fights are good as a distraction, but they pale compared to those of past and future Sonic games. Similar to many platforming games of its time, Sonic Adventure introduces 3 hub worlds which link off to the game's many levels. While here, you'll solve puzzles, fight bosses, and watch cutscenes between the levels. And if you don't know what you're doing, figuring out what to do can be a major time sink. When you've played this game as many times as I have and know where everything is, it just becomes another formality that you wish you could skip. Personally, I much prefer just going from stage to stage with maybe a world map for selecting levels. Still, I find that Sonic Adventure's hub worlds are largely inoffensive. At the very least, they're generally small, easy to navigate, and this pink ball of energy will tell you where to go if you want to speed things up. The game's hub worlds are also where you'll run across upgrades, equipment that will give all the characters new abilities they'll need for later stages. Overall, Sonic's mode is easily my favorite in the game. His levels are varied and mostly well designed, and he controls pretty damn well. In terms of the conditions of a good Sonic playstyle, his stages are fast-paced and fun, there's some great platforming, the familiar Sonic set pieces are all there, and accomplishing your objective is as simple as getting to the end. His new 3D gameplay is definitely not perfect, but neither was the old 2D gameplay. Like my colleague, Nikon Aquamagna, I would consider Sonic Adventure worth picking up for Sonic's scenario alone. After all, his scenario is the longest in the game and lasts about as long as Sonic 1 and 2 combined. That doesn't necessarily make the game good as a package, but yeah. The second playable character is Tails, whom you unlock early on in Sonic's scenario. His story is largely the same as Sonic's, though it diverges on the occasions that the duo happen to separate. The dialogue is rewritten to reflect a more menacing Eggman and a more assertive Tails. While the rewritten dialogue is a nice touch, it is annoying to have to rewatch 80% of Sonic's cutscenes all over again. Generally, Tails plays a lot like he did in Sonic 3 Knuckles. He runs and jumps as fast as Sonic, and he can fly if you press the jump button in midair. While he doesn't have a homing attack, he can still roll into a ball and attack enemies with his tails. His control is just as tight and responsive as Sonic's, and because he can fly, he's also capable of taking a lot of shortcuts. Good thing too, because Tails' gameplay revolves around racing Sonic to the end of 5 stages. I think even the most vehement opposers of multiple playstyles in Sonic can have a good time with Tails. His gameplay is fast-paced platforming action at its finest, and his flight capability makes for really interesting level design. Overall then, Tails' mode is my second favorite playstyle in the game. Like Sonic's gameplay, Tails is loyal to all the mechanics and stylings of the Sonic universe. He's really fast, there's plenty of platforming, his objective is simple and fun, and he interacts with all the familiar Sonic set pieces. If you enjoyed Sonic, you'll most likely enjoy Tails as well. The third playable character is Knuckles, who you'll unlock not long after Tails. As in Sonic 3 Knuckles, Knuckles is the designated guardian of the Master Emerald on Angel Island, a mystical gemstone that allows said island to float. One night, however, chaos appears on Angel Island, smashing the Master Emerald into pieces and causing the island to sink into the ocean below. Anxious to return Angel Island to the skies, Knuckles sets off to restore the Master Emerald by locating all of its shards. As with his classic amigos, Knuckles plays largely like he did before. He's just as fast as Sonic and Tails, but he can also glide through the air and climb around on walls. His control is just as tight and responsive as Sonic and Tails, and it's a lot of fun simply running around stages as fast as you can. Unlike the other scenarios, Knuckles' level design is a lot more non-linear. The goal is to run around 6 open stages looking for the 3 shards of the Master Emerald. Sometimes they're hidden inside of enemies or set pieces, and sometimes they're just lying out in the open. Regardless, this objective is a logical extension of his climbing and gliding mechanics. Getting around stages is straightforward, and large set pieces within stages act as landmarks to help you get around. A radar system will help you home in on the emerald, while this pink ball of energy will point you in the right direction. In conclusion, Knuckles' gameplay is fun, even if it's not exactly challenging or amazing. He's plenty fast, there's a lot of platforming, his objective is straightforward and simple, and all the familiar Sonic set pieces make an appearance. And that brings us to another topic. One complaint that a lot of classicists have regarding Sonic Adventure's gameplay is the greater linearity of the level design. In the good old days, they explain, Sonic games had a ton of branching pathways that rewarded your curiosity. As I've been saying since the Sonic 1 review, I much prefer linear level design to something that's complicated for its own sake. Still, these people obviously didn't play as Knuckles because his level design is about as open-ended as it gets. Even so, Sonic stages do occasionally feature side pathways and optional pickups. Even if these levels don't have as many pathways as the classic era, it was likely due to technical limitations of 3D games at the time, so this criticism is hardly fair. More important than whether or not the level design is linear is whether Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles' levels are fun to play, which they are. Another major complaint people make about Sonic Adventure is the camera. As with the game's presentation, a lot of people seem to have forgotten just how lackluster cameras usually were back in the early 3D era. Crash Bandicoot had problematic backtracking, Resident Evil had pre-rendered fixed camera angles, and even Super Mario 64's camera only moved in unhelpfully large increments. Let's also not forget that the camera in the classic Sonic games wasn't perfect either. Because Sonic was always in the dead center of the screen, slamming into enemies and stage hazards you couldn't see in time was not at all uncommon. especially in Sonic 2. That being said, I would agree that there are some instances where Sonic Adventure's camera can leave something to be desired. Regardless, the camera is still very functional for the most part, and is almost always pointing in the direction you want it to be. Even when it isn't, you can still turn the camera left and right using the left and right triggers. While some might find this mapping to be awkward, it wasn't at all uncommon among many games of the time. See the Spyro trilogy, Mega Man Legends, or even the first Kingdom Hearts game on PS2. Moving on, the fourth playable character is Amy Rose, who was first introduced in Sonic CD. Basically, Amy comes across this blue Flicky that's in the crosshairs of one of Eggman's robots. After helping the Flicky escape, Amy decides to take him to Sonic for protection, and the story just goes all over the place from there. Amy's scenario is by far the most cutscene heavy in the game. Despite having maybe 20 minutes worth of gameplay, including hub worlds, it took me about an hour to finish. In my opinion, Amy's scenario is by far the most tedious in Sonic Adventure. Amy controls similarly to Sonic, except she can use her giant Pico Pico hammer to destroy robots. If you run and use the hammer at full speed, she can do the satisfying vault move. Unlike other characters, however, Amy's acceleration is way off. It takes her too long to get up to full speed, and even then she's still a lot slower than any of the other characters. Turning too quickly will also kill your acceleration altogether. The objective is to get to the end of 3 stages while avoiding Zero. If he catches you, you die. But that's hypothetical, because I've never seen it happen in my 11 years of playing this game. Zero does nothing but run after you and try to hit you, but if you keep hitting him with your hammer, he'll never catch you. Because of this, Amy's gameplay doesn't bring much to the table in its mere 3 stages. Amy's gameplay isn't terrible. Her objective is straightforward, and she interacts with the usual rings, springs, and robot enemies. Unfortunately, she lacks the speed of the other characters, and there's comparatively little platforming going on here. Couple this with an arduously slanted cutscene to gameplay ratio, and Amy's gameplay becomes something to sit through rather than a fun playstyle. Still, Amy is a million times better than the 5th character, Big the Cat. Big is the worst gameplay style in the entire Sonic franchise, bar none. Like the woodsman from Hoodwinked, Big is Sonic Adventure's joke character, a segue into La La Land. And to be clear, that's not why I dislike Big. Basically, Big's friend Froggy gets possessed by chaos, eats Big's lucky Chaos Emerald, and sets off to travel the world. Big tries to get his friend back, running into the game's other characters all the while. So, from what I understand, the Dreamcast premiered alongside this wacky fishing controller. Rumors circulate that Big the Cat's gameplay was designed with this peripheral in mind, but oddly enough, Sonic Adventure is not one of the 6 Dreamcast games compatible with this device. For each of Big's 4 stages, you'll have to fish for Froggy in a pool of water. Yes, you heard me. It would be one thing if Big's fishing gameplay was fun, but it makes Twilight Princess's fishing look amazing. All you can do is cast your lure into the water and hope for the best. You can jiggle the analog stick in random directions to move the lure in whatever direction the game feels like, but you have absolutely no control over the camera whatsoever. Eventually, something will bite the lure, and if you happen to know that you're supposed to flick the control stick, the game will let you reel it in. Even if you can manage to reel in Froggy, sometimes it just doesn't count. What happened here? These stages can take anywhere from 2 to 10 minutes, depending on whether the frog wants to cooperate. While Amy's scenario is the most tedious, Big's scenario is definitely the worst when it comes to gameplay. Even Sonic the Werehog has more to offer than Big the Cat, folks. The most credit I can give is that all the familiar set pieces are there, even if you're never given an excuse to interact with them. Otherwise, Big's gameplay offers very little in the way of speed, not much in the way of platforming, and accomplishing your objective isn't very straightforward considering the confusing control and design of the fishing mechanic. Even as a little kid playing this for the first time, I knew that Big the Cat sucked. Would you believe that not wanting to play Big was why it took me years to learn of the last story segment? Thankfully, the 6th and final player character, E102 Gamma, is pretty fun, even if his boss fights require no effort. Essentially, you play as one of Dr. Eggman's more advanced robots who eventually develops his own consciousness and rebels against his creator. While his arc is probably the most interesting in the game story-wise, it's also incredibly cutscene heavy toward the beginning. There's one point where you have to sit through over 5 minutes of cutscenes between stages. Gamma's gameplay borrows from a 1999 Sega Saturn game called Burning Ranger, which was also developed by Sonic Team. Your objective is to get to the end of 5 stages while shooting enemies to replenish the timer. If the timer runs out, you die. But as long as you keep shooting enemies, that's never gonna happen. The more enemies you lock onto at once, the greater time bonus you'll get. It's a lot of fun blowing the fuck out of everything in sight and seeing how many enemies you can lock onto at once. Gamma controls fairly well, but I find that his turning is a little too precise for my tastes, which makes him somewhat slippery at high speeds. Still, it wasn't anything I couldn't get over for the sake of enjoying the game. His levels have a decent amount of platforming, but they're a little too short for what they're trying to be. I guess it's better that they don't overstay their welcome, but it seems like all of these stages are over the moment you start to get into them. There's also not much in the way of challenge. Thanks to the lock-on, enemies aren't much of a threat, and seeing as most bosses can be beaten with simple button mashing, things feel a little too easy. In conclusion, Gamma's gameplay is a lot better than Amy or Big, but still not quite as good as Knuckles. He's fast, he's got a decent amount of platforming, the familiar set pieces are there, and his objective is straightforward and simple. I just wish the cutscenes weren't so long, and that his levels were a little longer and more challenging. Otherwise, Gamma passes as a good Sonic gameplay style. So in sum, that's 3 great characters, 1 decent character, 1 meh character, and 1 bad character. I'd say that when it comes to these gameplay styles, Sonic Adventure is mostly solid. Besides Big and Knuckles, the objectives revolve around getting to the end of a stage, which really isn't much of a break from the classics. Most of them control really well, most of them are pretty fast, there's a decent amount of platforming, and most of all, there's fun to be had. That's not to say that these gameplay styles are perfect or even subjectively as fun as the 2D side-scrolling gameplay of the classic series, but for the first fully 3D Sonic game ever made, these playstyles really aren't that bad. Some might accuse the game of being glitchy, but most of what I happened to come across was pretty harmless. Even this part of Emerald Coast is just dandy as long as you hold up on the analog stick. Beyond the main story mode, Sonic Adventure brandishes plenty of extra content, and this is something that a lot of reviewers neglect to mention. In the game's trial mode, you can replay any of the game's 30 missions at any time by selecting them from the list, but that's only counting the C missions. Each stage for all 6 characters also sport B and A missions, but you're only required to finish the C missions during the adventure mode to beat the game. The B and A missions add additional objectives that vary depending on the character. This might involve collecting a certain amount of rings, or reaching the end of a stage within a certain time limit. By completing these missions, you'll earn emblems. In case that's still not enough content for you, Sonic Adventure also features a virtual pet mode called the Chao Garden. The Chao Garden has a surprising amount of depth, but it's honestly something I really couldn't care less about. If you want to know more about it, I'm sure someone else has posted a detailed video discussion of the Chao Garden's machinations. And that more or less wraps up my thoughts on Sonic Adventure for the Sega Dreamcast. In general, it has aged quite a bit, and that's coming from someone who grew up with this game. But hey, the same thing can be said of such classics as Final Fantasy VII, Super Mario 64, Resident Evil, and Star Fox 64. I can see why some people really like this game and why others can't stand it. Your odds of enjoying Sonic Adventure depend greatly on your personal taste and preference regarding Sonic gameplay. If you're willing to give the different playstyles a chance and evaluate them on their own merits, I think you'll find that the game delivers a mostly fun, if flawed, experience. If you're satisfied with nothing less than a one-to-one transition of 2D Sonic gameplay to 3D and won't accept any changes to that basic formula, then you're probably not gonna like this game. Neither side is necessarily right or wrong, nor is the classicist side necessarily the more objective one as it often frames itself to be. As for me, I'd call myself a Sonic Adventure centrist. It's not my favorite 3D Sonic game of all time, but I would never call it a god-awful abomination either. I'd argue that the game resides somewhere in between those two extremes. It's a mostly fun experience that hasn't quite stood the test of time. That being said, Sonic Scenario still offers some of the best 3D gameplay in the series, and Tails, Knuckles, and Gamma are all fun in their own ways. I also enjoy most of the level design, and the soundtrack is fantastic. Still, I think I'd enjoy this game a lot more if the story and credits weren't so repetitive, and if the cutscene to gameplay ratio was a little more balanced. The fact that I have to play through the same uninteresting story in 6 different scenarios to finish this game once makes me playing it kind of a mild slog, at least in my personal opinion. Even when I'm playing the GameCube version and can skip cutscenes, I've still got to run all over hub worlds and pick up keys to open levels. I like Sonic Adventure well enough, but I still opine that there are much better Sonic games out there, 3D and 2D. And that's pretty much all I have to say about Sonic Adventure. join me next time for the second game in the Dreamcast era, Sonic Adventure 2 for the Sega Dreamcast. Until then, I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and I hope you all enjoyed the review.